Our reading comes from Psalm 51, 1 through 17. Generous in love, God, give grace. Huge in mercy, wipe out my bad record. Scrub away my guilt. Soak out my sins in your laundry. I know how bad I've been. My sins are staring me down. You're the one I violated, and you've seen it all, seen the full extent of my evil. You have all the facts before you. Whatever you decide about me is fair. I've been out of step with you for a long time, in the wrong since before I was born. What you're after is truth from the inside out. Enter me then, conceive a new, true life. Soak me in your laundry and I'll come out clean. Scrub me and I'll have a snow-white life. Tune me into foot-tapping songs. Set these once broken bones to dancing. Don't look too close for blemishes. Give me a clean bill of health. God, make a fresh start in me. Shape a Genesis week from the chaos of my life. Don't throw me out with the trash or fail to breathe holiness in me. Bring me back from great exile. Put a fresh wind in my sails. Give me a job teaching rebels your ways so the lost can find their way home. Commute my death sentence, God, my salvation, God, and I'll sing anthems to your life-giving ways. Unbutton my lips, dear God, I'll let loose with your praise. Going through the motions doesn't please you. A flawless performance is nothing to you. I learned God worship when my pride was shattered. Heart-shattered lives ready for love. Don't for a moment escape God's notice. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
You may be seated.
Life sometimes hits you hard. Sometimes it puts you on a path where you don't want to be. Sometimes you make mistakes that seem like they can't be fixed. But there is God. And He wants to cover those mistakes like a gentle falling snow. God gives you freedom. He gives you hope. He gives you love. He gives you life. He gives you sight and happiness. He gives you direction. He gives you a fresh start.
So last week, if you were here, I kind of left a cliffhanger, if you will. But I started talking kind of in the same direction that H was going in the week before, and will continue in the next coming weeks. But he talked about your direction, not your intention, determines your destination. And when I heard that sermon, David is who came to my mind. And so last week, I talked a little bit about who David was. And I think we needed to know who he was so that we could really understand when we went through 2 Samuel how far off the path David strayed. And so I shared with you that David, starting as a young boy, was picked by God. That he gained the Spirit of the Lord. He was anointed to be king. And we learned about his growing up and about the great things he did. When you hear the name David, I think lots of times the first thing that pops into our head is Goliath. and that was a great feat for him. But just his character as a man, as he grew, was really, for quite some time, unquestionable. He followed God's path. But as being a human, as we all are, often our attention influences our direction. And sometimes something can catch our eye, and it takes us off the path. And that's what happened to David. He was walking on the roof, and Bathsheba caught his eye. And there were so many things that he could have done right to stay on the path in which God had chosen for him. But he just kept making wrong turn after wrong turn. And I shared with you a little bit at the end that like David, and like I'm sure most of us at some point in our lives, we've taken wrong turns. And I shared a little story about Gary, Indiana, and if you're from Gary, Indiana originally, or you've ever lived there, you have family that lived there, I apologize. But I was at Gary, Indiana at 11 o'clock at night and was terrified. And I took one wrong turn that got me into a situation which just heightened my fear. And then instead of turning around, I just kept taking wrong turn after wrong turn after wrong turn. So I had left you with that story, but I had also left you with the question, how far out of your way do you need to go before you realize that you need to turn around? Because had I, after that first wrong turn, turned around, we'd have got back on the highway and we would have been okay. After David saw Bathsheba, if he had simply turned around and gone back in, things would not have gotten so far out of whack for him. Often it's that first step. You take that first step, and then the second one seems a little easier. Thankfully, in Gary, Indiana, I had my co-pilot, which was Andrew. This was a couple years ago, so he'd have been about 15, and he's on the GPS. And within 2 turns, he got us back on the highway. But I would have, saved about 40 minutes of anxiety and fear had I simply turned around after that first wrong turn. Imagine what David could have saved had he simply turned around. In the story of David and Bathsheba, what is finally determined is not David's sinfulness, but God's grace. David's sin was forgiven. He was allowed to live and to remain king, despite having broken nearly half of the 10 Commandments. Because God's grace is the most outstanding feature of the story. Now, if we look at 2 Samuel 12:13, I kind of skipped over that one last week. I skipped over that one little verse. Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan replied, the Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. Today's living word came from Psalm 51. And you really should read Psalm 51 against the background of the story of David and Bathsheba. It's a story about God's forgiveness of sin. It's about God's character that keeps the relationship intact. David is made right with God by God's grace. So in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, we learn what kind of man David was. And then what happens when you can get distracted. Psalm 51 shows us the love and grace of God. David begins by pointing out God's character, and then he turns to his own sinfulness. And if you walk through Psalm 51, the first few verses are about God and what God is and what God can do. God is generous in love. He gives grace. He gives mercy. And I use this from the Message Bible because that's the version that really spoke to me about this particular psalm and Bible verse. And if we look at the next few, David talks about wipe out my bad record, scrub away my guilt, soak out my sins. And he tells God, you're the one I violated. You've seen it all. You've seen the full extent of my evil. Yes, David, his decisions hurt and affected others' lives. But when it comes right down to it, when we sin, we not only hurt ourselves and those around us, but we are sinning to God in God's eyes. God is the one, excuse me, God is the one who has the power to forgive and to restore. Then he continued by, he refers to the inavailability of human frailty. That in each human life, in the human situation, that sin is pervasive. We're born into it. We cannot escape it. While sin is a matter of individual decision, it definitely has a corporate dimension that affects us, despite our best intentions and decisions. We are all human. We all make mistakes. We all falter off the path that God has for us. And I know H does bottom lines and I don't, but if I say anything this morning that you hold on to, this is what I want you to hear. God forgives sinners. God forgives sinners. So it doesn't matter who you are in this room right now. It doesn't matter how far off the path you may be. You're never too far for God. So if you take nothing away from this morning or last Sunday, always remember that. Sin is not the final word about humanity. God desires not sinfulness, but faithfulness. While sin is inevitable and pervasive in the human situation, it's not ultimately the determining reality. In Psalm 51, David continues, but now we're in the portion where he's asking about forgiveness. Soak me in your laundry and I'll come out clean. That's not a question, that's a statement. David knows he is strong, his faith is strong enough to know that all he needs to do is ask. Soak me in your laundry, God, and I will come out clean. Scrub me and I'll have a snow white life. But don't look too close for blemishes Just give me a clean bill of health. God, make a fresh start in me. Shape a Genesis week from the chaos of my life. Don't throw me out in the trash. Bring me back from exile. Here he's praying for forgiveness and recreation. The real point is that by God's action, David has been or will be forgiven and transformed. Sin and guilt will not be the final words. They will give way to joy. It is God's fundamental character to restore, rehabilitate, and recreate sinners. And David's life depended on it. His life depends on God's willingness to forgive and God's ability to recreate. In biblical terms, to be saved means to be restored to conditions that make life possible. For David, forgiveness means salvation. So David walked through, he talked about God and God's character and what God could do. Then he mentions his sin, then he moves on to forgiveness. And then he talks about others. And he says, give me a job teaching rebels your ways so the lost can find their way home. Commute my death sentence, my salvation. I will sing anthems to your life-giving ways. Unbutton my lips. I'll let loose with your praise. Having been made new, he now promises to share his experience with others. The worst of sinners will now become the teacher of sinners. God desires the whole self. God desires humble, contrite people who are willing to offer him their whole selves. What David is doing is offering his whole self to God. So the rest of the story. So I've shared with you before a little bit about my background. And so I was raised in a Methodist church, and my mom was very active in church and would on committees, and she helped in the nursery, and she taught. And because she went to church, I had to go to church. My dad did not go to church, so my brother didn't have to go to church. And if you can tell, I'm still agitated by the fact that he got to sleep in on Sundays and I didn't. But my mom was very active. But when she was home, we never once ever talked about God. We never prayed at meal times. We never had conversations about faith. So I grew up in church, but I grew up with kind of a skewed perspective. Because I thought that church was contained in a building. And I saw the pastors and their families and what they looked like. And in my perspective, in my opinion, what I saw was a couple who were perfectly put together with awesome children who always listened and never did what they weren't supposed to do. But you know about PK kids, so you know. But that was my perspective, and that's how I grew up. And when I became an adult, I quit going to church because I didn't have to, because I was an adult and I could make my own decisions. And then there was a few years where I was not a good girl. And you, whatever that statement conjures for you, times that probably by about 3, 5, 10, and it'll give you an idea of how far off of the path I had gone. And then you add in my perspective of church and how people who go to church are and how they behave. It never occurred to me that God would forgive anything that I had ever done. Because church people were people who stayed on the path, who lived in very nice houses with little white picket fences and never made mistakes. I'm sure that's how you all are. And that was my perspective. So when you carry around that perspective, trying to get back on a path you don't even know is there is nearly impossible. And then, I don't know if you have a mom like this, but my mom is relentless. Even now, she's still. And she kept prodding me and poking me. You gotta come back to church. You gotta come back to church. By this time, I was on my second marriage, current. I'm still with my, sorry. Let's just make that clear. I'm still with I don't want you to think I'm on 4 or 5. No, I'm still currently married to that husband. So, on second husband, we have 5 sons by this point. None of my children had grown up in church. My mom's poking and prodding about getting me back. And she's telling me this story about this new pastor. And she shares with me how cool she thinks this pastor is. And she gives me such an outlandish, to me, description of a pastor that I had to go see for myself, right? Because this is a pastor who's bald and has earrings and rides a motorcycle, and he sings and plays a guitar like a country western singer. And I'm like, well, that's interesting. So I'm like, just for, I can't say that word in church, but just for and giggles, I go to check this country western singer pastor with, earrings and a motorcycle out. And he gave a sermon in such a way that I actually understood what he was talking about. And then he sang, and his kids sang. Well, that's kind of cool. So I came back again, and I came back again. Then I met his wife. And his wife shared with me something that no one had ever shared with me before. And she said, your path, your relationship with God doesn't have to look like anybody else's. I was like, really? Because my perspective had always been that everybody's path looked the same. And because I didn't look like you, then I clearly couldn't have a relationship with God. So I became more involved in church. I did on one weekend in Columbus, was at a Women of Faith conference, and I did give my heart to Jesus Christ. And my life began to change. And I could feel with one right turn, that I started to see that there actually was a path. Now, I'm not going to say that I don't often trip and stumble and fall. I do. I'm human just like we all are. But the thing is that now I recognize that there is a path and that I'm on it. And the cool thing is that God's on it with me. And I know there was some questions when I first got here, because people were like, she doesn't have shoes on when she's up there. And I shared a sermon a while ago and kind of gave you a little bit of my background. And I started the story about why I am in my bare feet. And I told you that I would share the rest of the story. When you're on the outside looking in, because I never truly felt on the inside when I was in church. Because of my perspective on what I thought church people were supposed to look like and how they were supposed to act. So I was always on the outside looking in. And then my relationship with God began. And with every good decision, every time that I turned it the right way, I got closer and closer to that path, to that relationship, to the journey that we're all on. And the closer I got to the path, the more at home I actually felt inside the church. When I'm at home, I don't know about you, but I like to go barefoot. Because I'm comfortable, because it's home. It's the one place that you always hope that you're comfortable with, right? It's the one place that when your kids come back to, that they can kick off their shoes and prop their feet on the coffee table. Church was never like that for me growing up. Not even into early adulthood. I go barefoot because I am finally comfortable in God's house. I would hope that all of you felt comfortable enough in God's house to take off your shoes and to prop your feet. Because God forgives sinners. You can never go too far off of the path. God will always guide you, always forgive. David's perspective, he thought he was the king, he knew he was the king, and he thought just one simple glance, one simple act, and then he could just get right back on the path in which God had chosen for him. And God even tells him at one point, I had given you everything, and if you had wanted more, all you ever had to do was ask. How often do you continue on your present course when you know you need to turn around? Right now, today, are you where you should be? If not, have you asked God to light your way? God desires a relationship with you. He desires your whole self. God has the willingness to forgive and the ability to recreate. All you need to do